Hello, it's Jeffrey Christian. It's actually around 1 o'clock on the afternoon of Tuesday, the 1st of October. We're recording this for release on Friday, the 4th of October. There'll be some of the people at CPM Group will be traveling and unavailable to do a video on Friday. So we wanted to do this. As a result, we are going to talk about something that people have asked us about. There are two sets of issues related to politics. And we're going to talk about those because they're less time sensitive, perhaps. That said, as I speak, there are news reports that Iran has fired some missiles, significantly sized ones, at Israel in retaliation for some of Israel's recent military actions in Lebanon and in Yemen, as well as in Gaza. The two big issues that have come up is one, people have asked us to talk about the Middle Eastern conflict and the situation and how it may affect gold and silver. The other one is a persistent comment by people that we don't quite understand, or maybe we do understand, begging us to stay away from politics. Now, they act as if, there are 2 points to make. First off, politics are important or critical to understanding the gold and silver markets. If you don't think that politics affect gold and silver, I'm not sure what you think. Second thing is, if you're offended by my political views, that's your prerogative. I happen to have a very complex set of political views, and they're based on a tremendous amount of information that I have gathered and distilled and analyzed and worked with over the last 50 years, as well as stuff that I brought with me from my childhood and my rearing. I don't really particularly care if I'm offending you. If I am, you should try to think this thing through. Discourse and critical thinking are critical. They're central to living a life well. And to ignore comments from the other side is extremely foolish. I have people who think that I'm an arch conservative. I have people who think I'm an arch liberal. Both of them are incredibly wrong, and I don't care. I'm busy. So let me just move here. This is the gold price as of the morning of Tuesday, October 1st. The price had gotten up to $2,700, a little over $2,700 last week, and it was coming off. I won't bore you with where we think it's going on an ultra-short-term basis because by the time you see this, that'll be behind us, or a portion of it will be. And this is the silver price. Similar pattern. Moved over 32, 33, has come back down. Both of them are looking a little bit vulnerable to short-term downward moves, but both of them are expected to show further strength over the next 6 months. And one of the reasons we say that is because of politics and the tremendous amount of both international and domestic politics. What affects gold and silver prices? Everything. Well, not everything, but pretty much a lot. We have a list of political events that we used to use in our thing. And I remember in 1983, 84, people asked me why gold prices hadn't risen when Argentina occupied the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. And we had to explain that the Falkland Islands and a war between Argentina and the United Kingdom was not particularly germane to any area that either was a major producer or consumer or investor in gold. Similarly, in 1988, during the Iran-Iraq War, when the United States government reflagged Kuwaiti tankers and sailed the 7th Fleet into the Persian Gulf for the first time to provide protection from Iraqi jets to Kuwaiti tankers, the price of gold fell sharply, confounding a lot of people in Europe and the United States. The answer was that a lot of gold investors were in the Gulf region And they were very worried about the Iran-Iraq war, which would be dragging on for a long period of time. And Iraq was trying to broaden the war for reasons no one could quite understand. So when the Seventh Fleet sailed in and said, we will protect not only Kuwaiti, but other tankers in the Persian Gulf, their problem was solved. They sold gold when what looked like an escalation of a military situation to U.S. and European investors occurred. So you have to be very careful. Not everything affects gold, and sometimes the effects on gold are not quite as direct. But it's not just politics, it's economics, financial market conditions, and expectations and opinions about financial market stability, overall societal trends and conditions. All of that stuff is important to gold and to silver. And almost all of it affects gold and silver prices via investment demand. Now, politics, international, domestic. I do want to say a few more words. Martin Merlebild, fabulous econometrician in the 1980s, was working on gold price models. He had like 31 or 33 variables in his multivariate econometric models. Others have done the same thing. CPM Group, we were initially were part of Goldman Sachs still when he started working on it, but then after we left Goldman, we continued to provide him with advice and suggestions because we were working on similar gold models ourselves, although we didn't have 33 variables in it. Another point I make about politics, Noam Chomsky talked about it once. He said, if you listen to talk radio, when they're talking about politics and government, there aren't a lot of call-ins with strongly voiced opinions. Now, this was several years ago, before the U.S. became much more divided and hostile toward each other. He said, contrast that with sports radio. And here, sports radio, you have these people who are seen as experts on this radio show, and people call in and they know all kinds of information, all kinds of statistics about the sports, and they feel free to argue with the experts. There's a very big difference. Now, I would say that what he was looking at was governance as opposed to politics. But the reality is that over the last 10, 15 years since he said that in an interview, American politics and society have become much more divided and divisive. I first noticed in 2000 that people didn't want to talk about politics to each other. It got worse. Now they don't want to talk about it. They just want to scream at each other about it. So it's very difficult there. Now, talking about international affairs, and let's focus on the Middle Eastern crisis. One of the first points I'd make is that oil is a less useful political tool now than it used to be. In 1973, with the Yom Kippur War, there was an oil embargo and by OPEC. And it ground the economies in Europe, the United States, and Japan to a halt. We had long lines waiting for gasoline at gas stations. The oil price rose like fourfold, probably from $1 to $4. No, it's a little bit more than that, before coming back out. And we went into a very deep recession on a global basis, right? Those days have changed. First off, the U.S. and other non-OPEC production has risen very sharply, and there's a tremendous amount of oil readily available in capped wells in the United States as well as in other countries. So OPEC has less political clout using oil as a political weapon or tool than it used to have, and everyone knows that. In addition to that, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has further reduced the usefulness of oil as a political weapon. That's not to say that people might not try to use it, but they'll probably be far less successful, and they'll be painfully aware of the self-inflicted wounds they impose on themselves and their countries and their governments, and they are their governments, by imposing embargoes or jacking up the price. So oil is probably less important. The second thing is the Middle East is a very complex situation, and it's not clear how it's going to get resolved, and it's not clear how it might directly affect gold demand. A lot of groups throughout the Middle East are very much pro-oriented to using gold as an investment and a store of wealth. It's not clear that a lot of those groups will be involved in buying gold because of increased political unrest. A lot of them might feel that this is not their fight. There are certain parts of the Muslim world that will be glad to see Iran engage in a major battle with Israel because they don't like Iran and they assume that Israel will win. Another historical point is that Israel has U.S.-produced bunker-busting missiles capable of drilling down through mountains into the underground nuclear research and development installations in Iran that can be tipped with nuclear warheads that would get down there and basically create a plasma event in those underground nuclear facilities. In 2007 into 2008, there were people in the Israeli government as well as the United States government, including the vice president, who were vehement that it was the time to use these nuclear-tipped bunker-busting missiles and take out the Iranian nuclear research facilities. When it happened, once they lost power, George W. Bush, to his credit, resisted that, as did the leaders of Israel at the time. There was a very strong impetus to it, and my understanding from people who knew them, who were close within the White House, was that George Bush stopped talking to Dick Cheney. Basically, Cheney was so upset that Bush wouldn't allow this to happen before they left office. So there is this historical capacity for things to get escalated very strongly in the Middle East. And as we've seen in recent weeks, the Israeli government has moved away from being as cooperative and coordinated with the U.S. government as they have in the past. They have the equipment there. They have the capacity to do this unilaterally. The U.S. government probably is warning them very sternly not to do it. But for the Netanyahu government, this is a matter of its political survival. So this could get worse. Whether it drives gold investment demand sharply higher is not clear. Because, as I said, there are certain people who are gold-oriented investors and savers throughout the Middle East who might not necessarily see a war between Iran and Israel as being particularly a bad thing. They may see it actually as a potential to inflict serious damage, economic and otherwise, on two countries that they don't necessarily count as friends. So the Middle Eastern situation is important. It's very critical. Oil, we probably won't see a major factor. We've had a series of developments throughout the Middle East over the last year and over the last several years, and oil has not been used as a weapon. It probably won't be used as a weapon, but there are other ways that this thing could get out of hand. Whether or not that causes an increase in gold demand and price remains to be seen. Now, the Middle East is just one crisis. We also have Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And Ukraine's counter offense and counterattack now, occupying a significant piece of ground within Russia and attacking Russian military and defense and energy installations deep inside Russia, and pushing for, quote, permission from the United States and Western Europe to actually defend itself further by being more offensive in Russia. This has caused serious strains within the Russian hierarchy, as well as within Russian society. And you have a very unstable situation there that could get worse or could get better. China and its neighbors, near and far. China has had this more militaristic stance toward Taiwan. It remains to be seen what's going to happen. It also has had this problem, increased military and militaristic stance toward the Philippines and the South China Sea and Vietnam, and it has issues over in Myanmar and against India and Pakistan on the southern borders of Tibet. So China has a variety of issues. It's not clear how it's all going to be going on. And then there are other global issues. One of the things that we're watching for is a post-U.S. election wave of actions. With many of these situations, it's quite possible that the situation could change dramatically for the worse or for the better after the U.S. election. The U.S. government has been hesitant to give Ukraine the tools that it needs to win the war. It could, after the election, regardless of the outcome of the election, it could say, okay, go for it. That could worsen the war briefly, and it could also hasten a resolution to the war between Russia and Ukraine. In the Middle East, you also have a situation where the U.S. government is probably restraining some of its actions that it would like to take in advance of the election. But once we get past the election, regardless of who wins the U.S. election, and we probably won't know that we might know it right away, but we might not know it right away. But regardless of who wins it, the U.S. government may pivot its policies toward Israel and the situation in the Middle East. And Israel may take the opportunity to unilaterally or with the assent of the United States government take a more hostile approach toward its Muslim neighbors and terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. It's also quite possible that what you're seeing with the Israeli military actions against the Hezbollah and the Houthis and Hamas is all predicated on the view that the U.S. may radically change its policies related to providing offensive armaments to Israel after the election. So the U.S. election could change a lot of things. Has to wait and see. Those are just the international political factors. Then you have the democratic ones, the domestic ones. You have the U.S. I don't need to go through the litany. And then you have other countries too. Russia has its issues. India has its political issues. China, Myanmar, other countries in Asia, the UK, EU states, Latin America. You've had several coups in Africa, and the Russian government has been supplying military support for coup leaders in several African countries. So there's a lot of unsettled domestic politics that all could affect gold more or less. There's a big wad of political issues that have to be paid attention to, and have to be paid attention to in terms of their potential relevance to gold and silver investment demand and consequently price. I'm sorry for people who think that politics aren't important to gold. that I've spent 20 minutes talking about it, but other people think that that politics are important to gold, and that it's very important to know some of that history and what's really going on driving some of the political developments. We will be having an open forum for our clients on November 20th, 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Online questions and answers. You can send in questions ahead of time. You can ask questions during the event. I'd like to open it up more to a discussion. What we found is people would rather send in questions as opposed to speak them out, and that's fine with us too. We like discourse. Speaking of discourse, you can always write to us at info@cpmgroup.com and say, let's talk. You may be able to help me with my exposure to commodities and precious metals. You can go to our website. You can buy our yearbooks. You can buy other reports. There's also a lot of free reads that we post on our website. That's all I have for now. Take care of yourself. Take care of those around you. Do something good for the world, and we'll talk to you next week.